protection. That means you're under the king's nobility. That means the king and all of the auspiciousness that comes with being associated with the king is associated with you. So there's dignity, there's honor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about entering people into a shade, which is a metaphor for Jannah. And so there's a lot of honor and dignity, right? That's associated with being in the shade of Allah, especially when there's idafa to Allah. What do I mean by idafa to Allah? I mean the shade of God, right? If you say the shade of God, that's different from the shade of a tree. You've honored the shade. The shade has a special status because it is the shade of God, right? If you say Abdullah, that's a very special name. Anyone here named Abdullah? It's a very special name because you have an idafa to Allah. The slave, the servant, the servants of the Rahman. These are very special servants because there's an idafa, right? So that's about the shade. But let's talk a little bit about al-yawm. Let's talk about this day, because you don't really fully appreciate what is being said in this hadith until you appreciate a little bit more the imagery of this day, right? Now, this is a day that, first of all, in the Arabic language, إِذَا عَظُمَ الشَّيْء, when something is elevated in importance, تعددت أوصافه وكثرت أسماؤه. General principle in the Arabic language, right? When something is important, the descriptions of it increase and its names increase. How many names does the Prophet Muhammad have? He has many names. Many names. It's not just Mustafa, it's not just Ahmed, it's not just Muhammad. He has many, many names. Why? Because of the dignity. How many words in the Arabic language for sword?
8.
How many words do you think there are for the word sword?
I got 8.
8. So we got 1 for 8. Remember, if something is important, its descriptions increase and its names increase. How important was the sword for the Arabs? Very important. How many names do you think it has? We have 8. Any other guesses? 15. Any more? How many words in Arabic language for sword? About 500.
Oh,
About 500, right? So when something has an importance, the names increase. Imam al-Tabari, probably very familiar with his tafsir, he's written other books as well. One of the books that he wrote is called At-Tadhkira, right? At-Tadhkira fi ahwali al-mawta wa umuri al-akhirah, in regards to the condition of dead people and the reality of the hereafter. And he spends a section on Yawm al-Qiyamah, and a section of that he spends on the names of the day. Because when something is very important, the names increase. And one of the best ways to know the reality of something is to know the reality of its name. Actually, one of the opinions, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Adam, or when he tells us, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا, he taught Adam all the names. One opinion is that he taught him the actual name of everything in existence. The reality of it, right? The name that indicates the reality of it. A lot of times we name things in a way that does not indicate the reality of it, right? You know, if I'm sitting on a wooden chair and I just name it wood, you might want to burn it. But if I name it chair, you might want to sit on it. The way you name something, it affects how you think about it, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has actually given us many names of the Day of Judgment in the Quran, and by understanding those names, we can understand the Day of Judgment a little bit better. So he has a section here on the names, and I'm going to go over a few of these names. So one of the names is, of course, Yawm al-Qiyamah, the day of standing. And it's called this because, first of all, this is a day when the angels stand before Allah. يوم يقوم الروح والملائكة صفا. The angel Jibril, the angels, they all صفا, row after row after row. They all stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You will stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of the creation will stand, and it's a prolonged standing, right? And so one of the realities of this day is that it's a constant day of standing. One of its names is As-Sa'a, the hour, right? It's called that, Imam al-Tabari says it's called that because when you say something, a sa', it's like you're implying it's very close. right? And so if you say like hour, that means like you feel like it's another name is al-azifa, right? Yawmul azifa, it's also the day azifa is something that's about to happen. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls it a sa' because innahum yarawnahu ba'ida wa narahu qariba. They see it as far away, but we see it as very close. It's indeed very close, right? Now, the reality of that, maybe you don't quite appreciate. But the other thing is, kalamhil basar, it's going to happen just like the blink of an eye. And it's going to happen so fast, right? When it happens, it's going to happen. And so another name that's given is asa. So that has to do with the fastness at which it's going to happen. Yawm al-qiyamah, asa. أخبرني عن الساعة. The angel Jibril says, tell me about the hour. ما المسؤول عنها بأعلم من السائل. The Prophet Muhammad says, the one being asked doesn't know anything more about the one asked. He himself doesn't know, right? The angel Jibril doesn't know, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows it, but Allah sees it as close. Yawmul ard, the day of presenting. All of the creation is presented before each other. All of people who want shifa are going to present themselves to Adam and then another prophet, and then they're not going to be able to give them shifa until they all say, go to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Everyone is going to be brought before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is Yawmul Ard. So another name is Yawmul Ard, Yawmul Faza', the day of shaking. The entire earth is going to shake. People's hearts are going to shake, right? Yawmul Ba'ath, the day of resurrection. Actually, Ba'ath in the Arabic language is more specific than resurrection. التحريك شيء بعد سكونه, right? وإظهار شيء بعد إخفائه. It is to move something after it's been still for a while and to make it visible after it's been hidden. Meaning bodies, like there are bodies that are just, scattered all over the earth. They're hidden. They've not moved for centuries. They're dead. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to give life to it, bring it out of the graves, right? So that's the idea of Ba'ath. So it's the day of resurrection, Yawmul Hisab, the day of accounting, right? The day when everything you've ever done is going to be shown to you in your book. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He's merciful to you, He will overlook and He will cover many of the things in your book. But if He's just and He takes you into account, then He'll take you into account for everything that's actually in your book. So there are many names for the day of judgment. Al-Qari'ah, the striking or the calamitous event, right? Al-Qari'ah is to strike something. It's like something that strikes your heart, right? And so this is another name, Yawmul Haqq, the day of truth, i.e. something that is bound to happen, right? Yawmul Fasl, the day of separation. You are separated from everyone and you are grouped with people according to the way you lived your life. The pious with the pious, the impious with the impious, right? Yawm as-Sada, Yawma idin yasadda'un, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. Sada' is to divide. Yawma idin yatafarraqu, in another ayah. So this is a day where people are divided. You might even be divided from your family. And that's not even going to bother you because you're not even going to be thinking. You're going to be فَإِذَا جَاءَتِ الصَّاخَةُ يَوْمَ يَفِرُّ الْمَرْءُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ وَأُمِّهِ وَأَبِيهِ وَصَاحِبَتِهِ وَأَبِيهِ. When the terrible sound is made for the day of judgment, you're going to flee from your partner. You're going to flee from your mother. You're going to flee from your father, right? You're going to flee from your brother, from your companion, your best friend. And you're going to be separated into groups. The groups of people that you are separated amongst are the types of people that are just like you. They had the adab like you, they had the character like you. Not born where you were born, not family necessarily, character. That's why on the day of judgment, the only identity you have are your deeds. People get so caught up with identity, right? And identity is all just about what? Like, it's like, where you born? Nowadays, all this batil nonsense, like gender stuff. Like, this isn't identity. This isn't, your identity is your deeds. That's who you are. That's what defines you, how you live in your life. Because on the day of judgment, Yawmul Fasl, Yawma idin yatafarraqun, Yawma idin yasadda'un. You are divided, you are cleft away from everyone else, and you are only grouped and paired with people who lived like you did. then you'll see who you are. Then you'll see what your identity really is. It is only in that day that you're going to see what your identity is, right? So Yawmul Fasl, these are all different names that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. And there are many, many more. We don't have time to go through all of them. But Yawmul Tanad, right? Tanad, Yawma Tanad, Yawma Tuwalluna Mudabirin. This is a day, Tanad describes a day where people are just like running in all kinds of directions with no purpose. Running in all, he says, وَهُوَ الذَّهَابِ فِي غَيْرِ قَصْدٍ. You're running this way, then you run that way. Then you run this way, then you run that way. You have no idea where you're going. There's so much commotion, right? There's so much fear. You have no idea where you're going. Can you imagine that? Actually, in Surah Ibrahim, there's a scene Allah gives us of the Day of Judgment. مُهْتِعِينَ مُقْنِعِي رُؤُوسِهِمْ. Muhti'in means people are running straight ahead, but they have no idea what they're running to. Just pure fear is causing them to run. Pure fear, okay? That's what muhti'in means. What does muhti'in mean? Running with no sense of direction. Muqni'i ru'usihim. Muqni'i ru'usihim is this. So people are running with their heads like this. Looking straight up because they're looking at the sky and how the sky, Allah is going to wrap the sky up like you wrap up a paper in a book. People are just looking at this. And their head is locked up like this. Muqni'i ru'usihim, that's what it means. It's locked up. They can't even, la yartaddu ilayhim tarfuhum. You know what this means? Tarf, you know what tarf is? When your eye goes like this and it looks off to the side, that's tarf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, or like if your eye looks up, that's tarf, that's the edge. Your eye has gone to the edge, like that. Allah is saying your eye will not come back after it does that. Meaning you're looking at a scene, you're so terrified by the scene, you don't even like turn your pupil back to where it originally was. That's how scared you're going to be. لا يرتد إليهم طرفهم وأفئدتهم هواء. And their chests, where their hearts are, will be emptied. This is another way of describing fear. Because like, you ever been so afraid you feel like your heart is just sinking to your belly? You ever felt that feeling? That's what's just constantly going to be like that. وَأَفْئِدَتُهُمْ هَوَاء. It's just going to be hollow. Your hearts are going to be hollowed out of fear. Can you imagine this? Right? And this is why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, people are going to be resurrected, khufatan uratan ghuralan. They're going to be resurrected naked, barefoot, and uncircumcised. And Aisha says, Ya Rasulullah, الرجال والنساء ينظر بعضهم إلى بعض. Men and women are going to be looking at one another. And he says, Ya Aisha, al-amru ashaddu ila an yanduru ba'duhum ila ba'd. This is more intense, that people would look at one another. It's so intense, it's so scary. People are going to be naked, they're not going to be looking at each other. It's not even going to cross your mind. That's how horrific this day is going to be, right? In fact, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is going to transition into shade. He says, "Man yasurruhu an yanzura ila yawm al-qiyamah." Whoever wants to look at the Day of Judgment, فَلْيَقْرَأ إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. Let him read إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this surah, إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. When the sun is folded up. Kara yakuru takawurun is to wrap something up or fold it. Like they use this for imama, right? Kara al-imama. Like the imama that you wrap around your head. This idea of wrapping is the same verb that's used for takwir, okay? Meaning the sun somehow is going to be like undone, if you will. The sun is going to be undone. Shamsu kuwira. Actually, and this is going to be our transition into talking about shade. I'm going to talk about that here in a second. But let's just look at the Day of Judgment just a little bit more, right? So we appreciate the severity of this, right? إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ وَإِذَا النُّجُومُ انْكَدَرَتْ. And when the stars, and kadarat means to fall from their place. Meaning the entire celestial orbit is going to become unstable. The entire universe. Here's the theme of the Day of Judgment. everything you used to associate with stability will look unstable. You're like, every day, man, the sun comes up. I can rely on that. I have no idea what's going to happen in class. I don't know when I'm getting this exam. I don't know what's going to happen with this job, but the sun's going to come up the next day. Well, on the day of judgment, no. The things like the stars, every day I look up, the stars are there, right? Galaxies are there, constellations are there. I can always guide myself. I know they're going to be there. No, they're not. وَإِذَا النُّجُومُ انْكَدَرَتْ, right? وَإِذَا الْجِبَالُ سُيِّرَتْ, and the mountains are going to look like clouds. يَوْمَ يَكُونُ النَّاسُ كَالْفَرَاشِ, another surah, يَوْمَ يَكُونُ النَّاسُ كَالْفَرَاشِ الْمَبْثُوثِ. People are going to look like moths spread out. What does a moth fly like? It's complete chaos, right? وَتَكُونُ الْجِبَالُ كَالْعِهْنِ الْمَنْفُوشِ, and mountains are going to be like wool puffed up. Like wool puffed up. Like that stability you had with mountains, you thought of with mountains, that stability is gone, right? وتكون إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم انكدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا العشار عطلت. And the ishar, who knows what the ishar is? The female camels, what about the female camel? What specifically? They're pregnant at 10 months. That's why they're called the ishar, right about to deliver. The most precious possession you could have as an Arab. A pregnant camel about to deliver. Nothing more valuable than a camel in the Arabian desert. Nothing. Okay? That utila, people are just going to leave it. No one's going to even care. In other words, no money, no possessions are going to have any value at that. If the camel that's about to deliver has no value for it, nothing's going to have any value for anyone. وَإِذَا الْوُحُوشُ حُشِرَتْ, wild animals are going to be gathered together, right? And Allah goes on and on to describe, but this is the scene. The scene of the Day of Judgment is one of utter chaos, complete fear, right? Complete confusion. And all the things you used to associate with stability will no longer be stable. Now, let's go back to the sun. There are specific narrations about what's going to happen to the sun. We just mentioned in ayah in the Quran, إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. We said the sun's going to be undone. It's going to be like folded up, right? And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says one thing that's going to happen is the sun is going to come close to the earth to the point at which it's right over the head, literally right over the heads of people, right? And he says, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he says in a hadith, you're going to sweat to the point at which your sweat is up to your earlobes, or like half your ears, okay? So this is what's going to happen with the sun. But we also know, and how do we need to make sure we can explain the discrepancy between this. The Day of Judgment is also a time of complete darkness, right? There's going to be a point at the Day of Judgment where there's no light whatsoever. And the only light the believer is going to have is the light of their limbs and their face that they used to make wudu with. And the more you're on the straight path, the more light you're going to have. يَوْمَ تَرَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَسْعَى نُورُهُمْ بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَبِأَيْمَانِهِمْ بُشْرَاكُمُ الْيَوْمَ جَنَّاتٌ. Right? That day you're going to have light in front of you and to your right. Because there's not going to be any light at all. Right? And the munafiqun, they're going to say, "Unzuruna naqtabis min nurikum." Look at us so we can get some of your light. Because no one is going to be able to see where they're going. Okay, so how do we make sense of this? We know the sun is the source of light. The sun is going to come down. It's going to be super hot. Right? But then at some point, there's no light. How do we make sense of this? You know, I'm not trying to explain this via science, and this is not dogma. But we already know some things about astrophysics and the way planets evolve, right? We know that it's a natural part of a planet's life is that it expands and the gaseous composure and construction of that planet alters. There's some morphologic changes. There can be some temperature changes as well, right? And then it contracts. And as it contracts, it loses its light. We already know this about how like a supernova develops and possibly like how a black hole develops, right? It's very possible that the different ahadith in Quranic ayat that are talking about heat and light, are talking about the stages of evolution of the sun as it's going through its end life. Possibly. I'm not saying this is aqidah. This is not. I'm saying possibly it could be this. But what it seems like, if we put jama, if we put all these traditions together, it seems like in the beginning of the day of judgment, the sun is going to expand and come very close, be nearly on top of our heads. People are going to be resurrected with a different physical capacity to handle that, but they're still going to be so hot they're going to sweat up to their earlobes. But at that point, when the sun is above your head and the earth is actually flattened out, وَإِذَا الْأَرْضُ مُدَّتْ, Allah says the earth is going to expand. It's going to be flattened out, right? Will there be any shade at that point, early on? If the sun is directly over there, how do you get shade? From an angle. But if the sun is directly over your head, can there be any shade? There cannot be shade. It's not even according to physics, it's not possible. So you see, even from a scientific point of view, that makes sense. And then later on, right, the sun is going to lose its light. And that's part of the meaning of takwir. It becomes undone, folded up. Dhahabu nuruha, right? As Imam al-Tabari talks about, it's going to lose its light. And at that point, that is when the only light that people will have is the light of the believers. يَوْمَ تَرَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَسْعَى نُورُهُم بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِمْ, right? بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَأَيْمَانِهِمْ بُشْرَاكُمُ الْيَوْمَ جَنَّةٌ. Like we mentioned, right? And the better you made your wudu, the more light your limbs are going to have. But now let's go back to that initial phase, when the sun is right above you and there's this chaos and there's this confusion and there's this utter complete fear. Now in this moment, the Prophet Muhammad says there are 7. Remember, there's more than that, but he singles out these 7 that Allah will shade with his shade. And this shade is not just a protection from the sun. This shade is a protection from fear. It is a protection from chaos. It is a protection from all of the things I just described. Only the believers, only the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to dignify in this moment will have this kind of protection, right? And there will be no shade except this shade. Remember, the ulama said it's either the throne of Allah, the shade from the throne of Allah, or it's a specific shade that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates. And then he begins to narrate who these 7 are. The first one, should I read it?
Yes, sir.
Imamun Adil, a righteous leader. Now, there's a lot to say about this, okay? Imamun Adil, first we need to define terms. What is Adil? Someone tell me, what is Adil?
Justice.
Justice, what is justice? What is that? Being in the right place? Putting something at the right time in the right place, something like that, right? Okay, that's good. Okay, implementing the Sharia, actually, that's probably the best answer thus far. Because what if the United Nations got together and said, we think this is what justice is and what human rights is. And part of human rights is that men should be able to marry men and women should be able to marry women. Is that just? No. We don't accept that definition of justice. That's injustice. That's injustice to the very people that you're saying can do that. That's not justice, right? We do not depend on culture and society to define justice for us. First of all, justice is what Allah said is justice. It is the compilation of all of what Allah said is good and the avoiding of all of what Allah said is bad. It is the implementing of everything that he said is wajib and the avoiding of everything that he said is haram. It is everything he has defined as hasan and avoiding everything that he has defined as shar. That is justice. Now, adl in the Arabic language specifically is independent of time and place. Meaning this is like a vertical definition of morality that comes directly from Allah. It's independent of time and place. We do have another word in our deen, in our sharia called urf. And urf is something that good people in society, righteous, upright people in society deem as good based on the specific time and place we live in, okay? If it's from the urf of society that you hold the door for someone when they're walking behind you, that's part of what's deemed good manners. Islam will adopt that, okay? As long as it's within the realm of Sharia, we accept what is urf. But urf is horizontal, it's negotiated, okay? It changes with time. Ma'ruf changes with time, okay? Part of what is urf, for example, is how much money do you give in a marriage for the mahar? That changes with time and place in society, okay? And Islam adopts that as it changes. But adl never changes. It's something that comes directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Qist is a word that's very similar to adl, but is more specific, right? Yes. Can adl be translated? Can urf be translated as tradition? You could make that argument. Yeah, you could make that argument. Right? Yeah, I mean, you could, and this is why they say in Sharia, urf muhakkam, right? Urf can take the legal precedent of ruling. Ada muhakkama is another synonym for that, okay? But only if it does not contradict the Sharia, right? So, yeah, I mean, tradition is a loose kind of term, but you have to be very specific about what you're talking about. It cannot be used in a general sense. It has to be defined specifically, right? So this is something similar, but is more specific to a person's individual needs in an individual situation. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, in Surah Hujurat, فَإِذَا فَاءَتْ فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَهُمَا بِالْعَدْلِ. When the aggressive party has turned away from their aggression, you know, then use Allah's divine justice to say, okay, now here's who owes who what, and here's the reparations, and here who should be punished, and here's who shouldn't be. وَأَقْسِطُوا. At the same time, go out of your way to be full in measure in fulfilling that justice, right? So adl is divine justice, right? And the first point, as the brother mentioned, is since this comes from the Sharia, the first role of an imam is to apply the Sharia, right? Tatbiq al-Sharia. If you're in a position of leadership and you're in a position of imamate, if you're in a political power position, like Umar says, Inna Allah yaj'alu bi-sultan man la yaj'alu bi-Qur'an. Allah will implement things with political power that cannot be implemented just by being pious with the Qur'an, right? In other words, you have to, in order to implement the Qur'an, you have to implement on a political level the Sharia. We don't, as Muslims, we don't, you know, render unto Caesar what is unto Caesar. No. There's no separation. You know, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. Whoever does not judge according to what Allah has revealed, that person is a disbeliever. That person is a corrupter. Okay. Now here's a question though. Living in a society that is ruled by non-religious injunctions, can you participate on a political level? Is that something permissible? Here you have some ikhtilaf. But in general, if you can attain a position and by that position you can enjoin good and forbid evil without affirming and confirming and validating and supporting things that are deemed unjust by the Sharia, then yeah, you can do that. And the example, the proof of that is Yusuf. Yusuf in the Quran was, you know, gifted, right? And Allah said there was a king at the time, and the king had his own religion, Dini al-Malik. He had his own religion. It was not the religion of Allah. Allah didn't say Dini Allah, Dini al-Malik. And the king tells Yusuf, I'll put you wherever you want you. Pick any position you want. And Yusuf didn't say, Anta kafir, you know, هذا نظام الكافري, you know, تعد عنه. No, he didn't say anything like that. He said, اجعلني على خزائن الأرض. Make me the treasurer. And he was able to implement, as a prophet of Allah, the injunctions of Allah in his particular sphere with independence. Like if you can do something like that, okay, you know, but as a ruler, as someone who is invested with power, you cannot look beyond the words of Allah for legislation. That's the first thing when it comes to justice, right? And the second part of this is you cannot be someone who follows their desires. This is the quickest way to injustice as a leader, is just following your desires. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Dawood in the Quran, Ya Dawood, inna ja'alnaka khalifatan fil ard, fahkum bayna nasi bil haqq, wa la tattabi' al hawa. Oh Dawood, we've made you a khalifa. Judge between people with truth, i.e. Sharia. All the prophets had Sharia. Okay? Judge between people with truth and don't follow your desires. فَيُضِلَّكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. This will cause you to misguide people, right? And any leader whose love for their self and the fulfillment of their desires is more than their love for Allah will never be just. You will never be just as a leader until your love for Allah and your love for the pleasure of Allah is more than your love for your own self. You will never be just. Umar learned this directly from the Prophet. He learned it directly. He went up to the Prophet one time, and he said, O Prophet of Allah, I love you more than anyone else except myself. And the Prophet said, no, not yet. You still don't have Iman. Umar went away and he thought about this. And then he came back. And anyone here who's a student of Arabic, student of Balagha, and you're studying Tawqeed, listen to what Umar says, because Umar, by the way, Umar was very knowledgeable about the Arabic language. He was baligh. One time a person was talking to him about a mas'ala, and he made some grammar mistakes. And he said, your grammatical mistakes are harder for me to hear than this particular mas'ala that you're talking to me about, right? He was very baligh in the Arabic language. And he brings out all the possible emphasis that you can create in the Arabic language to make a single point. He comes back to the Prophet Muhammad after the Prophet tells him, not yet. And he tells the Prophet, فَإِنَّهُ الْآنِ وَاللَّهِ لَأَنْتَ أَحَبَّ إِلَيَّ مِن نَفْسِ. Look at all of the emphasis here. What he says. First of all, he says, فَإِنَّهُ. Inna in the Arabic, harf tawqeed. Inna is already an emphasis, a type of emphasis. Then he says, فَإِنَّهُ. He puts a pronoun on it, but the pronoun is not referring to anything, so it's za'idah, which is also a type of tawqeed. It's also a type of emphasis. فَإِنَّهُ الْآنِ. Then he says right now, which he didn't have to say. And when you bring out the specific time that you're talking about, this is another type of emphasis. Wallahi, this is a qasam. Swearing by Allah, this is another type of emphasis. La anta, this lam muzahlaqa or lam tawqeed, this is also another type of emphasis. Anta, in cases you now, ahabba ilayya min kulli shay, are more beloved to me than anything else. Right? And the Prophet says, now. That's why Umar could be a good leader. Because Umar understood, for him, the pleasure of Allah was a priority over his own pleasure. Which meant the rights of people were a priority over his own rights. Which meant the interests of people were a priority over his own interests. Right? So that's Umar, right? One time the entourage came, I think from Byzantium one time looking for him. They found him sleeping under a tree. And, they were surprised because there were no bodyguards around him, And, they realized, they said, Hakimta, you ruled, fa'adalta, and you were just. Fa'aminta, and you felt safe, fa'nimta, so you're able to sleep. You're able to just sleep under a tree with no bodyguards. We're struggling to sleep in our own palaces and all these bodyguards around us, but because you're just, you can sleep at night, So that's the first thing, not following your desires. And the litmus test of this is the pleasure of Allah more important to you than your own pleasure? That's the litmus test. If you cannot pass this litmus test, you have no business being a leader over Muslims, over anyone, right? Because what happens when you're a leader? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. You have resources now, you got employees, you have wealth, you got all these things. You see what happens when a person doesn't have tazkiyatun nafs. Look at the palaces of some of the dictators in the Muslim world. You see what happens, right? And so if a person does not have tazkiyatun nafs, then it's very difficult. Hawa mutaba'a is one of the things the Prophet Muhammad says destroys people, especially in the position of leadership. The next thing is that this leader has to be subject to checks and balances. You cannot be a leader if you cannot accept advice from people. You cannot be a leader, a just leader, if you cannot accept being checked by other people. Allah says in the Quran that, وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهِ النَّاسِ بَعْضَهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ لَفَسَدَتِ الْأَرْضِ. If Allah did not dafa literally is to push back. Tadafu'a is to push one another, right? If Allah didn't if Allah didn't check one people by another, there would be corruption in the earth, right? And so the person who absolutely has to be checked is a leader. When Abu Bakr was giving his inaugural address, he told the people, أطيعوني ما أطعت الله ورسوله. Obey me as long as I obey Allah and His Messenger. فإن عصيت الله ورسوله لا طاعة لي عليكم. If I disobey Allah and His Messenger, you have no obedience to me. Someone from the crowd got up and said, if you go astray and disobey Allah and His Messenger, we'll correct you with our own swords. And you know what Abu Bakr says? He says, praise be to Allah, the one who has put me above people who would correct me with their own swords if I went astray. That is being checked. That is willing to be checked. You have no business being a president of a masjid if you can't take advice from someone. Just advice, just basic advice. Brother, I've been doing this for 30 years. You don't think I know what I'm doing? No, be humble. Umar was walking in a masjid one time and he accidentally stepped on someone. It was dark, there's no lights. He accidentally stepped on the guy, yelled at him. And Umar was with some people. The guy yelled at him, he said, Ittaqillah ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. The people who were with Umar wanted to beat him up because such poor adab. And Umar said, no. He said, La khayra fikum illam taquluha, wa la khayra fina illam naqbaluha. There's no good in you as a people if you can't say that. There's no good in me, us leaders, if we can't accept that. If you can't tell your leaders, Ittaqillah, there's no good in you. If you can't give advice to your leaders, there's no good in you. If leaders, us as leaders, we can't take that advice, there's no good in us. Checks and balances. Just because you're implementing the Sharia doesn't mean you're not prone to make mistakes. One of the ways in which Muslim governments have gone astray is this theocracy, to the point at which they think the government is the complete representation of God's will on earth. And no one can question it. No. Umar was given a talk one time and a woman stood up in the back and corrected him. He's saying the mahr is too expensive. She's saying you're decreasing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not restrict. Umar said, the woman's right. It's not a 100% theocracy where you can't even question what's going on. So ad-dinu nasiha, qul liman, qul li'a'immati al-muslimin wa ammatihim. The religion is advice. To who? To the leaders, to the general people, to everyone. Everyone should be able to take advice. Checks and balances. Now, just because you're taking, here's the next thing about a just leader. You'll be taking checks and balances, okay? But doesn't mean you should be taking checks. Right? You can't check the hand. Wait. You can't check the person that's giving you a check. You see? You can't check the person that's giving you a check. If someone is influencing you and you're in a position of leadership and someone is coming and lobbying you secretly, telling you, hey, you know what? This next election, don't even worry about it. There's just this fracking law. We just need some alterations to this fracking law because we have a lot of businesses now that are really dependent on the restrictions here being modified a little bit. The next round in Congress, if you guys could just pass this bill, really appreciate it. Don't even worry about the next election. We'll take care of that for you. By the way, do you think that's mentioned in the Quran? What do y'all think? What do you think? It is mentioned in the Quran? Where?
I don't know how to say, of course.
Where? Where's it mentioned? Who's got a Quran with him?
In their head or they got a couple in the head. Sure.
Verse number 188, Surah Baqarah. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَ النَّاسِ بِالْبَاطِلِ وَتُدْلُوا بِهَا إِلَى الْحُكَّامِ لِتَأْكُلُوا فَرِيقَ النَّاسِ بِالْإِثْمِ. Do not consume the wealth of people bil-batil, right? In a way that is unjust and incorrect. By the way, look at, for example, Allah says, do not consume wealth. He says, ta'kul, which is like what you do for food. You know what verse this comes right after? This comes right after the verses that deal with fasting in Ramadan. And it's not random. After Allah is teaching us self-control of physical consumption of food, He's then expanding the idea of consumption to metaphorical things as well. Your eyes can consume, your ears can consume, your nafs consumes things. And one of the things it consumes is the wealth of people. If you can learn how to not consume food in a time and place, I tell you, learn how to not consume the wealth of people in a way that is unjust. Because this is what leaders end up doing when they subject themselves to being influenced by people. So Allah says, do not consume, right after He talks about Ramadan and consuming food. He says, now do not consume the wealth of people bil batil. How? وَتُدْلُوا بِهَا إِلَى الْحُكَّامِ. Idlal is lowering a bucket into a well, right? And it's something that's hidden from the eyes of people. You're getting what you want, but it's not a real transaction open in front of everyone else. It's kind of sneaky, right? It's kind of sneaky. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you're lowering this bucket sneakingly, right? To who? To the hukam, to the people who are leaders, to the people who are making laws. Why? Because you want to influence them and you don't want other people to see that. What's that called? It's called lobbying. Lobbying, right? How, think about this. How in the world is alcohol legal? Alcohol is one of, I'm talking from medical, I'm just telling you from medical perspective. It's probably one of the most toxic substances on earth. On earth. If you do a comparison between the harmfulness of alcohol and marijuana, alcohol is probably, marijuana is harmful too, but alcohol is probably thousands of times, on an order of thousands of times more harmful than marijuana. How is alcohol legal? And still, marijuana is still not legal. I'm not advocating for marijuana. Marijuana is harmful too. I'm just saying, how does that make sense? You know how that makes sense? There's a lobbying group for alcohol. There's no lobbying group for marijuana. That's why. That's why. How is there no gun legislation to reduce the amount of guns? And people being shot every day, schools being shot up every day. You know why? Because there's something called the NRA. It's a lobbying organization. And leaders are constantly getting money from these people. And that's why the laws are the way they are. But that leads to corruption. These people get richer, poor people suffer more. And this is one of the ways you lose justice as a leader, is you open yourself up to this kind of influence. I used to work with a doctor when I was a student. I really respected this doctor. It's a family medicine doctor that I worked with. This doctor would not accept any gift from a pharmaceutical company. They would always come to him, and even if it was like a jar of candy, he wouldn't take it. He said, sorry, I can't take it. Why? Because he would not allow himself to be influenced in the least bit by someone who had some financial interest in his decisions. And this is something that's from the adab of a leader. You don't just take gifts from people all the time, right? So these are some of the points of leadership, and everyone is a leader in their own self, right? If you're not even an imam of a politic or something, you're still an imam in your own right? You're still kullukum ra'in. Everyone has a flock that they're responsible for. وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رِعَيَتِهِ, right? Everyone is responsible for their flock. So everyone has the duty of being a leader at some point in their life. And if anything, you're an imam of yourself, right? You're an imam of yourself and you'll be taken into account.
So,
Exactly. Being an unjust ruler could be a teacher. It could be a tyrannical husband. It could be, someone who's a boss and is given a position of leadership, right? So the idea of leaders, and it's not just someone in a position of politics, someone in a position of being an example. Allah made Ibrahim an imam. Inni ja'iluka linnasi imama. How many people followed Ibrahim? But why is he an imam? Because he's an example for all of mankind. Anytime you're put in a position to be an example, you're put in a position of imamate. And these rules apply to you. You're put in a position of influence, and these rules apply to you. So justice there is very important.
You want to combine these two?
Let's go one by one.
وشاب نشأ في عبادة الله تعالى.
وشاب نشأ في عبادة الله. So this is the second group. Okay. Shab is someone who's young, and the hadith is saying nasha'a is to grow up. Nasha'a fi ibadatillah, a young person who grows up in the worship of Allah. One of the most difficult times to worship Allah is in your youth, because you have so much energy that could be directed to other things, right? In fact, the word shab in the Arabic language, it comes from an etymological root that also has to do with lighting a flame, like a fire, like igniting a fire. And this is the idea of what it means to be young. You have so much energy, you just burn through things, right? So Imam Ali, he says, "Ash-shababa darbatun min al-junun." To be young is one portion of insanity, because you got so much energy. And that energy can go in so many different places, right? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the young person who had the chance to put that energy into so many different places decided that he was going to put that in dedication to learning, or for tazkiyah, or for service to the community, i.e. ibadatillah. And ibadatillah is something very general. There's rituals that are ibadah, reading Quran, praying, tahajjud, saum, all these things are ritualistic ibadah. But then there's mu'amalat that can be ibadah as well, as long as your intention is correct and it's according to the guidance of the Prophet, right? Daily actions, work, family life, you're just daily interactions, as long as they're under the guidance and teachings of the Prophet, and your intention is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those are turned into ibadat as well, right? So he's saying, like a young person, that energy can go anywhere. And he says nasha'a. And nasha'a is a very specific term. It means to grow, not to just grow up, but literally to grow. Literally like for plants, trees. Think about the metaphorical imagery, it's not coincidental. Like Allah says in the Quran, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ النَّارَ الَّتِي تُورُونَ. Do you see the fire in which you kindle? أَنْتُمْ أَنْشَأْتُمْ شَجَرَتَهَا أَمْ نَحْنُ الْمُنْشِئُونَ. Did you make the tree come out of the ground, or did we do it? I.e., he's using the growth of a tree, the word nasha'a, for the growth of a tree. This idea of growth, tree, growing, this is the idea of tarbiyah. This is the idea of tarbiyah. In fact, Raghab al-Isfahani, famous linguistic scholar, he says tarbiyah is when you take a seed and you plant it, and you give it its nutrients, its soil, its light, its water, and you care for it until it reaches its full potential. And then as a tree strongly rooted in the ground, it begins to give fruit. That's tarbiyah, right? Now, if we apply that metaphor to ourselves, we are that seed, and the environment is the people we hang out around. If you want to grow healthily as a tree, your environment needs to be healthy. The people you are around needs to be healthy. The things and you know what? This is the biggest environment today. This thing is your biggest environment. What you're looking at, what you're listening to, this is your sunlight. This is your rain. This is your soil. What happens to a tree that is constantly surrounded by putrid soil, droughts, Clouds that don't allow for any sign. What does that tree end up looking like after a couple years? Dead. That's what happens to your soul. Your soul looks dead. If you could see the spiritual realm, your body might look healthy, but your soul will look dead unless it's getting constant, right, spiritual diet of things that are good for its environment. So the idea of nasha'a is the idea of growing just like a tree, but every day that tree needs rain. Every day you need the Quran. Every day that tree needs sunlight. Every day you need the prophetic guidance. Every day that tree needs good soil. Every day you need that good environment, right? And our jobs as a community is to help our youth with that, right? Because their energy could go so many different places. Unless we provide them with those avenues, they will find other places to take that energy. So part of that is their responsibility. Part of that is our responsibility, right? And there's a saying in the Arabic language, "Athawab ala qadri al-mushaqqa." The reward is according to the degree of difficulty. The hardest time to avoid your passions is when you're young. But that's also when the greatest reward exists. That's when the greatest opportunity exists to be transformed, to be someone of special rank with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is when you're young. Because that's when you have the greatest incentive to do wrong, right? And there's also a saying, إِذَا قَوِيَ الدَّاعِي وَتَمَّ التَّرْكِ عَظُمَ الْأَجْرِ. When the invitation to do something wrong is very strong and you completely avoid it, the reward is even greater. وَإِذَا دَعُفَ الدَّاعِي وَتَمَّ الْفِعْلِ عَظُمَ الْوِزْرِ. And when the invitation to do something is weak, but you go ahead and do it anyway, then the punishment is very great. When you're young, the invitation to sin is very strong. So if you avoid it, the reward is very great. As you get older, the invitation is less. If you still do it, the punishment's even more. You see? That's why the best time to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is when you're young. So this is category number 2. Shab nasha'a fi ibadatillah, a young person who grows up, literally is raised up, literally grows like a tree. Tarbiyah in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
ورجل قلبه معلق في المساجد.
And a man whose heart, qalbuhu mu'allaq, is attached to the masjid. I'm going to give you another imagery here. Alaq, mu'allaq, is to be attached. This is the same word Allah uses to describe a stage of life of the fetus. Alaq in the Quran, right? Why? Because if you were to look at the fetus at this point of its life, it is literally alaq. Alaq means to attach. It also means like a leech-like structure, and that's another kind of like miraculous usage of verbiage of the Quran, because it actually does look like a leech as well, right? But it literally means to attach, because it is getting every nutrient, every bit of fluid, every nutrient it needs to grow and survive from the placenta of its mother. And it is completely attached to that. If it removes itself from that, it will die immediately. Now, that's the same word Allah uses that's the word Allah uses to describe a fetus in its mother. Why is that the word the Prophet uses to describe a man in the masjid?
Because the man without the masjid himself, like he sort of dies
Spiritually dies.
Even feels empty. It's like something that's like just like not right.
Feels empty, very good, but the same idea,
He needs it.
he needs it, exactly. Just like the fetus is completely dependent and needs its mother, it's alaq, it's mu'allaq, it is attached. That is on the bashari level. That is on the physical, human physical level, but on the insaniya level, your spiritual self, your soul will die if it's disconnected from the masjid. Your physical body will die as a fetus if it's disconnected from the uterus of your mother. But your soul will die if it's disconnected from your spiritual source of sustenance, which is the masjid. This is why Rumi says something beautiful in his Mathnawi. Rumi says, "Har kasi juz mahist zabash sir shod." Anyone other than a fish gets tired of water. Anyone other than a fish gets tired of water. You see, the ulama, the people of true spirituality, they are in masajid like fish are in water. You take a fish out of water, does it look comfortable? No, it does not look comfortable. But a man whose heart is truly attached, the awliya of Allah, that's when they feel alive, is when they're in the house of Allah and the words of Allah are being recited. And they know that there are angels here, and the angels are counting the people in prayer, and they know that the reward for the prayer is 25, 27 times more than praying by yourself, and the reward for giving adhan is tremendous. And so many hadith about the virtues of the masajid. The masajid are not just places of prayer, they are community centers. They were always community centers. There were places where people got ready for jihad. There were places where people learned how to read. There were places where Sahaba got together to wrestle for fun. The masajid were alive. They were not just places people went to pray. That's a musalla, right? But the masajid is much more than that. Especially for the awliya of Allah, this is where it's their water. That's the heart that is truly connected to Allah. A heart that is truly connected to Allah and is not interested in dunya, it is only interested in the hereafter. The masjid is like the water as it is like a fish. So a person who's reached that level of connection, that person is under the shade of Allah.
ورجلان تحابا في الله اجتمعا عليه وتفرقا عليه.
And two people who love each other for the sake of Allah. They meet for His sake and they leave for His sake. So, this is really about friendships. And who is your friend? And who is in your life that is inviting you to things? And what are they inviting you to? And who's doing the inviting, right? And there are many reasons why you have friendships. Like, we're social creatures, right? The previous hadith is kind of like about the introvert and how the introvert can stay in the masjid. But not everyone is an introvert. Some people are extroverts. They need people, right? Insan needs uns. That's one of the roots of the word insan. Uns, which is togetherness, right? In fact, one of the first dua that Ibrahim made when he left his family in Mecca, the very first thing he asked for, فَجَعَلْ أَفْئِدَةً مِنَ النَّاسِ تَهْوِي إِلَيْهِ. Make people's hearts incline towards them, because they need a social life. It's a part of our need. Our need as human beings, we're social creatures. We need that. We need friends, right? But people make friends for the wrong reasons. They make friends because some people make it easier for them to follow their nafs. Some people make it easier for you to kind of get into things that maybe you're not supposed to get into, right? And some people make it easy for you to waste time. But there's some people, the only thing they make you do is remember Allah. And that type of friendship, that is the most sweet friendship you will ever have. I'm telling you based on experience. There is nothing like it. There is nothing like it. And Allah says on the Day of Judgment, Al-Akhilla, Yawma idin ba'duhum li ba'din aduwwun illa al-muttaqin. People who were best friends in this life, in the next life, if that relationship was not based on taqwa, they're going to be enemies. They're going to be enemies. And so there's many reasons why we make friendships. There's many reasons why we have friends. There's many reasons why we get together. But people who are truly connected to Allah, they don't have time for a friendship that takes them away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They don't have time for a get-together that completely distracts them from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They get to a certain point in their life, the only people that can be their friends are people that continue to remind them of Allah. And that is a very high spiritual state to get into. And when you've reached that state, you've reached one of the categories who are under the shade of Allah on a day when there's no shade but His shade.
ورجل دعته امرأة ذات منصب وجمال فقال إني أخاف الله.
And a woman invites him to sexual intercourse. And she's of a prominent stature in society, very well-to-do, and also very beautiful. And he says, I fear God. So again, this is about mukhalafatul hawa. In fact, Ibn Qayyim, his sharh of the 7 people under the shade of Allah, he says, there's one common denominator amongst all of these people, and that is mukhalafatul hawa. They all go against their desire at its peak moment. These are people who go against their desire at its peak moment. Remember, Allah says in the Quran, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى. The person who fears standing before Allah and he pulls his hawa back. He pulls his nafs back from its hawa. فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةِ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. That person is guaranteed paradise, right? And again, this is something that is very difficult. This is something that a Sahabi at the time of the Prophet even asked permission for. In front of other companions, he said, "Adini fil zina." Give me permission to fornicate. This companion, young guy, did this in front of, and they were like about to whoop him. And the Prophet says, well, bring him here. And he sits him down in front of him. He doesn't go off. He doesn't say, you've caused shame and dishonor to our tribe. You are banned for life. He doesn't do that. He doesn't embarrass him in front of people. He doesn't say, if you were someone of taqwa, you wouldn't be asking this, and make him feel depressed. The Prophet understands this is a shab. This is a young person. What do we say about shab? Darbatun min al-junun. It's a portion of insanity, right? It's like a fire that's kindled and just constantly consuming energy. That's what a shab is, okay? The Prophet says, here, sit. Sit. Sallallahu alayhi wasallam. He says, would you like that for your mom? He says, no. He says, other people wouldn't like that for their moms. He says, would you like that for your sister? He says, no. He says, other people wouldn't like that for their sisters. Would you like that for your daughter? No. Other people wouldn't like that for their daughters. Would you like that for your aunt? He says, no. He says, other people wouldn't like that for their aunts. And he put his hand on his chest and he made dua for him. And that young man said, after that, nothing was more hated to me than the idea of fornication. You see, the Prophet taught him empathy. He taught him, look, put yourself in other people's shoes. What if that was your sister? What if that was your mom? You would hate that. So therefore, other people would hate that as well, right? But also, one of the things about our deen is hifdul ard, preservation of dignity. And nothing takes your dignity away like falling into your lusts. In fact, Ata, a faqih of Mecca, he wanted to give this point. And people asked him about like some questions. And he was talking about like hub, love. And there were young students, and Ata was an old faqih. He was from the tabi'een in Mecca. And they said, what do you know about love? You're an old man, you know? But they, you know, they said it in a nice way. And he said, okay, I'll tell you about love. Come back the next day. He gave him a tafsir of Surah Yusuf. And he started explaining Surah Yusuf. And he says, look what happens when you fall into your lusts, and look at how you lose status and dignity with Allah. He was talking about the situation when the wife of Aziz was seducing Yusuf, right? And the entire time up till now, Allah described the wife of Aziz as Imra'atul Aziz, which is a term of, it's a term of honoring her. Right? The wife of Aziz. But when the wife of Aziz, when she locks the doors and she seduces Yusuf and she says, hey talak, she says, come here, right? How did Allah describe her? Allah didn't describe her as Imra'atul Aziz. Allah said, وَرَاوَدَتْهُ الَّتِي هُوَ فِي بَيْتِهَا. He who she was in her house. And Allah uses a series of pronouns to circumvent using her name as a title of honor. By using a series of pronouns to get away from that. Why? Because the minute she did that, she lost her honor with Allah. And a series of pronouns are now used to describe her instead of the name of honor that she had before, which was Imra'atul Aziz. That's what happens when you fall into your lusts. And nowadays, the situation's even more pressing because you have this at your hands. And you don't even need to date someone, which is also becoming too prevalent, right? Muslims need to understand, like, there's no friendship with the opposite gender. That doesn't exist in our religion. You can't just be friends with another girl. Or if there are sisters listening, you can't just be friends with another guy. That doesn't exist in our deen. If you're interested in someone, you pursue them for the point of marriage, and that's it. Right? And all this like dating, and Muslims talking about dating and stuff like astaghfirullah. You cannot be alone with someone. You cannot have physical interaction with them outside of marriage. You cannot flirt with them. Right? Very basic things with gender interaction. But nowadays, this is at our fingertips. And you have Muslims who are falling into things like pornography, which is destroying your soul. It is absolutely destructive. And again, that shababa, that burning flame, it exists inside of us. And we're not thinking about our consequences, right? But shaitan wants to make things so available to you. He wants to make sin so easy to you, right? And so he puts this at your fingertips and he knows what you're struggling with, right? But that's when you have to say, Inni akhafullah. If anyone amongst you can't get married, let him get married. That's the only cure for this, right? Or continue to fast until you can learn how to control your desires, right? But for your eye to fall onto something like that, how undignified is that? To see two people or someone exposing themselves like this, and their dignity is being lost and you're just like looking at it and you're being aroused by it. How terrible is that for your own dignity, for your own honor? What does that do to your reputation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If you ever get an inclination to do something like that, you should strike yourself in the chest just like the Prophet struck that companion. And you should say, Inni akhafullah. Inni akhafullah. I fear Allah, because it's all going to be brought back on that day of judgment. It's all going to be brought back to you. So no matter what the situation is, mukhalafatul hawa, until you can find a halal way of fulfilling that desire, you have to pull back on your nafs and say, I fear Allah.
ورجل تصدق بصدقة فأخفاها حتى لا تعلم شماله ما تنفق يمينه.
So we're almost done. A man who, it's the last two categories, we'll speed this up. A man who gives, but gives so secretly that the left hand does not know what the right hand is given. Charity is a big part of our deen. Charity is a very big part of our deen, right? And sadaqah is not just charity. It's not just giving wealth. It could, tabassumu wajhi akhika sadaqah. To smile on the face of your brother is charity. To remove an object from the street, harm, is charity. Charity can be so many different. To help someone into their vehicle is a type of charity. All these things have been narrated in hadith, but specifically giving wealth, right? The sign of true sincerity, the sign that you're really truly doing that for the pleasure of Allah, because you tend to get some recognition for that, right? People tend to see that, people tend to thank you, people tend to honor you, people tend to raise you up, right? Someone puts your name in a masjid in a certain place, and now everyone sees that you're a kareem, generous person. You've kind of got your reward in this life already. But a person who's truly sincere, the ulama, they say they hide their good deeds the same way you hide your bad deeds. They don't want anyone to know. They don't want anyone to know, right? And that's an ultimate sign of sincerity. If you truly want to be from these special people who are given shade on a day when there's no shade but the shade of Allah, ask yourself this question. Would it feel the same to me if I hid this and I didn't let anyone find out, the same way I might hide a sin that I don't want other people to find out? Would it change my motivation in giving this charity in any way? And if it would make you less motivated, then you need to question your sincerity. But there's people who reach a certain level of ikhlas. They reach a certain level of sincerity. All they care about is what is Allah seeing. They know that Allah sees everything about them and Allah sees beyond them into their hearts. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنْظُرُ إِلَى صُوَرِكُمْ وَلَا إِلَى أَلْوَانِكُمْ وَلَكِنْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ وَأَعْمَالِكُمْ. God doesn't look at your external complexions. He looks at your hearts. What is your intention? Imam Ghazali, he says, if you give charity and your motivation goes up because people see you, that's a type of riyah. That's a type of minor shirk. If you give charity and you're more energized because people see you, that's a type of riyah. That's a type of minor shirk. If you give charity and you think people should respect you because you gave some charity, y'all better respect me. I gave some money. Y'all better recognize, right? That's a type of riyah. That's a type of minor shirk. Just because you think people should respect you, you shouldn't think anything. What does it matter what people think? What does it matter what you didn't do it for them? So the person of sincerity, they know it is so difficult to work out these nuances of the nafs. The safest thing is to just hide it from yourself. And you're so secretive about it that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. إِن تُبْدُوا الصَّدَقَاتِ فَنِعِمَّا هِيَ. If you let people know about your charity, it's all good. It's fine. وَإِن تُخْفُوهَا وَتُؤْتُوهَا الْفُقَرَاءَ فَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. But if you give it and make sure it reaches the people of need and you hide it, that is better for you. There is an art to charity. Okay? One aspect of our deen talks about who to give to and how much to give. That is called fiqh. That is fiqh. Okay? And you can read in books of fiqh how much to give and who to give to. Okay? But how to give, the actual giving itself is an art. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he taught us that art in his sunnah. Right? And there's many more ayat that talk about this, giving the best of what you have, right? Not following up charity with reminders, right? Sometimes you give, but then you follow it up with a reminder, but that invalidates your charity. There are many different things. We got to wrap up here, but there is an art to charity. And from this art of charity is hiding what you give. And a person who does that, and does it truly for the sake of Allah, has reached a level of sincerity that merits being under the shade of Allah when there's no shade but His shade. Last group.
ورجل ذكر الله خاليا ففاضت عينه.
And a man who remembers Allah by himself alone and his eyes tear up. This is kind of a continuation, but it's even more specific of the previous category. You know, it's very easy to well up as an imam when there's 100 or 200 people praying behind you. And it's very easy to well up in salah when there's 100 or 200 people around you, right? And inshallah, that's sincere. But it's very different when there's no one around and you have no distraction and your phone is off and the only thing you're thinking about is your own shortcoming and how great Allah is before your own shortcomings, and that brings you to tears. That is a level of sincerity that nothing else can kind of explain. So dhikr is another part of this category. And, you know, Ibn Qayyim, he says, you know, there's like a Jannah in this life. And if you haven't tasted it, you won't taste the Jannah in the next life. And that is the dhikr of Allah. There's a certain sweetness and halawa that comes with remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that constantly keeps you on the path, right? And Allah talks about remembering Him qiyaman wa qu'udan wa ala junubihim. All situations, standing, sitting, on your side, no matter what it is, a person who is constantly in remembrance of Allah is always making dhikr, whether they're in their car or whether they're going to work or whether they're like, you know, going up the stairs. They're constantly making dhikr. There's always situations and possibilities to do that. But the best time, the best thing to do, the best way to make dhikr is to make wudu, to face the qibla, right? And make a time, make a certain time that you devote to this dhikr. right? And it doesn't just have to be subhanallah, alhamdulillah. It could be qira'at al-Quran. It could be reading the Quran. It could be contemplating. That's also a type of dhikr, right? But to do this and to do it consistently is what is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قَلِيلٌ دَائِمْ أَفْضَلُ مِنْ كَثِيرٍ مُنْقَطَعٍ. To do a little bit consistently is better than to do a lot sporadically, right? And so you begin with whatever you can do and you just build up your consistency. If all you can do is saying astaghfirullah, la ilaha illallah, and salawat on the Prophet 10 times a day, each one, then just start with that. And just do that until that becomes easy. And then build yourself up until you're doing it 20, 30, 40. Don't restrict yourself and say, this is the sunnah, I gotta do it. No. Dhikr is something general, open, okay? But if you devote yourself to it, and you devote a time to it, right? And you increase your mindfulness and awareness as a result of it, then you begin to reach this level of sincerity that the Prophet is mentioning in the hadith. And you become one of the people who's under the shade of Allah when there's no shade but His shade. So these are the 7 categories. They all, as a common denominator, as Ibn Qayyim says, they all have to do with mukhalafatul hawa. Resisting your desires and resisting your temptations. So that's a big part of tazkiyatun nafs, right? Pulling back on your nafs when your nafs wants to go the wrong direction towards some hawa, some desire. That's a big part of tazkiyatun nafs. But also, the categories are kind of linear and related. And some of the ulama have explained it like this. It starts general as imamun adil, but it actually gets more and more specific. And the last category is actually the most specific category, and it's about sincerity. All of them are about sincerity, right? But the last category is the most specific. And some of them say, if you don't have this 7th category, then you have no business being in the first. And each one leads to the other. Meaning, if you can't remember Allah by yourself and fall into tears as a result of that, you will never be able to be a just leader over people. You have a lot of people, a lot of Muslims, they want to be, social activists, and they want to be, social justice warriors, and they want to, grab the megaphone and lead a campaign and do this and that and this and that. And they got a lot of energy and they want to lead. They want to be leaders. Okay. That's great. You want to be, socially active and you want to be an activist and everything. That's great. But don't forget the spiritual cultivation. That's one category, to be imamun adil. Don't forget the 7th, to work on your nafs to the point where you remember Allah by yourself and no one is there. And it brings you to tears. And if you can't do that, then you have no business trying to be a leader. Do this first. First comes remembering Allah until you can come to tears when no one is watching. Then comes doing some good deeds in public like charity and hiding it to the point where you can do it that no one even notices. Then comes, now you're out in society and you're being tempted. Maybe you're being tempted by a woman, and now you can control your desires on a more broad level. Then comes your social interactions and your relationships. And the people that you're making friendships with are people who are helping you along that path. And then comes, how are you spending your time? The majority of your time should be in places that help you grow and cultivate as a human being, i.e. the masajid. Then comes, how are you being raised? Where is your entire life going to? Right? And what are all the different components that are going into you growing as a human being, just like a tree that grows and cultivates into what it is? What are the things that are shaping you? What are the things you're allowing to come into your life to shape you? And that is shab nasha'a fi ibadatillah. Now, once you've done all of that, now you can be imamun adil. So it actually works in reverse. And they're all linearly related. And all of these people have that special maqam that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam teaches us. The hadith is so beautiful because it shows us that there is jama' between personal development and social cultivation, right? And that is what Islam is all about. It is about giving us the good of this life and giving us the good of the next life on an individual level, on a community level, on a social level. The last thing I'll say, they've interpreted like this so that it goes backwards, but they've also interpreted from top to bottom in the sense that as a society, the first thing you need is an imamun adil. If you have a just leader, then you can have people who grow up in the worship of Allah. You can have people who actually learn to be attention to the message. You can have people who form good social interactions. You can have values that spread in society so that people make good friends. They avoid impious interactions, and they actually have time to work on themselves. And so actually it goes both ways. And that's another beautiful interpretation of the hadith. And we'll pause here. If there's anything good that I've said, that is from the grace of Allah. If there's anything bad that I've said or anything incorrect, that's from my own shortcoming.
Should I say a few questions? The إذا أعظم شيء. Okay, what is the rest of it?
وإذا عظم شيء تعددت أوصافه وكثرت أسماؤه. When something becomes very important, its descriptions increase and its names increase.
And الثواب على
الثواب على قدر المشقة. Your reward is directly related to the degree of difficulty. The more you struggle to do something, the more reward you have for that thing.
There's one question in the chat that said, for the ones whose heart is attached to the masjid, does that apply for women as well?
All these things apply to men and women. So a woman cannot be an imam in the sense a man can be, in the sense of leading a prayer. There's also some restrictions of political leadership, some restrictions, okay? But a woman can still be a leader in her own sphere. And she can have her own sphere of leadership. She could be a boss at work, right? She could have leadership in many different positions, and that's possible and is, acceptable in Islam. The same things apply to her because she's going to have power and she's going to have influence and she's going to have resources, and all that applies. The same thing applies, though not to the same extent about a masjid, because a man is obliged to be in a masjid in a way that a woman is not obliged to. For example, it's fard for a man to be a Jum'ah. It's not fard for a woman, but it's still recommended for her. So the same thing applies. Okay, there's just a different level of intensity, but the same thing applies. The same thing applies about her relationship and friends. The same thing applies if a handsome man invites her to something that's immoral, because that happens too. And she says, Inni akhafullah. Absolutely applies. Absolutely, the same thing applies about her giving charity. And the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is giving. And absolutely it applies about her being by herself and remembering Allah to the point that her eyes well up in tears. Yes, the same thing applies essentially between men and women.
What is a muqna'i? It said Surah Ibrahim. What does it mean?
Muqni'in means heading towards something without any real intention. Sorry, that's muhti'in. Muqni'i ru'usihim is your head like this, looking up.
Anyone else have any questions for the Sheikh? Anybody? Nothing? No, that's the Sheikh. I'll take the mic.
Is it no comments, no questions, no additions, no subtractions?
What's the line for the Methnawi? The line for the Methnawi again?
Oh, the line from the Methnawi? Her kasi juz mahi, her kasi juz mahist, za'abash sir shud. Anyone other than a fish gets tired of water. This is the Methnawi of Jalaluddin al-Rumi.
Jazakallah khairan for everyone who came out and attended. May Allah bless the Sheikh. Unfortunately, the Sheikh is busy. He has work right after this, so